David, still young and the youngest son of Jesse, spent his days tending sheep in the fields. No one could have imagined that this humble shepherd would become a king. The Bible tells us this surprising and inspiring story, showing how David, from a simple life, was chosen by God to rule. He lived in Bethlehem, in Judah, in a modest family. For him, tending the sheep was more than a job. It was a way to learn valuable lessons in leadership and protection. Showing courage in the face of dangers that threatened his flock, and expressing his faith through music by playing the harp for the sheep, David cultivated a deep spiritual connection. Jesse, David's father, was a man of deep faith. When God sent the prophet Samuel to choose the next king of Israel, Jesse had his sons present themselves before the prophet. The oldest, notable for their stature and strength, were not chosen by God. Instead, it was David, the young shepherd, whom God indicated to Samuel to anoint. God's choice was not based on David's appearance, but on his obedient heart and strong faith. Despite being the youngest and seemingly the least impressive among his brothers, God saw unique qualities in him. Samuel then heard God confirm, "This is the chosen one," and anointed him right there. Thus David began his path not just as a shepherd, but as the anointed one, destined to lead Israel and take the throne. The Israelites and the Philistines were involved in ongoing disputes over land and long-standing hostilities. The situation escalated to the point where the Philistines mobilized their army for a direct confrontation. The two armies set up camp on opposite sides of a valley for the battle. In this context, the Philistines were notable for having Goliath, a warrior of impressive stature, as their main challenger. They proposed an individual combat. Goliath would fight against a warrior chosen by the Israelites. If Goliath won, the Israelites would submit to the Philistines, but if the Israelite warrior won, the Philistines would retreat. This challenge aimed to resolve the conflict without a large-scale battle, thus preserving many lives. Goliath, besides being physically dominant, mocked the Israelites, belittling their faith and bravery. As a result, the Israelites felt intimidated and hesitated to face the giant. Contrary to all expectations, David volunteered to face Goliath. Instead of wearing heavy armor like the other soldiers, he chose to go into the fight armed only with 5 stones, and most importantly, with deep faith in God. King Saul was surprised by this decision and questioned David, who explained that he had already faced lions and bears to protect his sheep. He stated that he did not fear Goliath because he trusted in something far beyond his own physical strength. On the day of the confrontation, as Goliath approached, David ran toward the giant. With the skill of his sling and divine intervention, he used only 1 stone to change the course of history. Goliath, seemingly invincible, was defeated. David's victory did not come through strength, but through the unwavering courage and faith of a young shepherd who trusted entirely in God. This event, which began with admiration and triumph, eventually sparked feelings of envy and betrayal. King Saul, anointed by God as the leader of Israel, initially saw David as a brave warrior and commander. However, over time, Saul began to feel discontent and envy. Although he had the opportunity to mentor David, Saul felt threatened by the young man's growing success. The situation deteriorated when the women of Israel began to sing, "Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands." 1 Samuel 18:7. This song, though celebrating the victories of both, deeply enraged Saul. Consumed by envy, his relationship with David changed drastically. Jealousy and paranoia led Saul to plot against David's life, sending him on extremely dangerous missions, hoping he would not return. Despite these efforts, David continued to prosper and remained under divine protection. As the relationship between Saul and David weakened, an unexpected friendship began to bloom. Jonathan, Saul's son, was impressed by David's bravery and integrity, and the two quickly developed a strong friendship. This friendship grew stronger as Saul became increasingly antagonistic toward David. Jonathan, courageous and loyal, even warned David about his father's sinister plans, providing crucial emotional support during this period. The relationship between Jonathan and David became a symbol of hope and unconditional support. Demonstrating loyalty, Jonathan constantly supported David, even at the risk of jeopardizing his own future and facing his father's disapproval. The highlight of this story is when Jonathan recognizes that David, and not he, was chosen by God to take the throne. This attitude reflected great humility and selflessness, as Jonathan wholeheartedly accepted that David's destiny was to become king, renouncing any personal aspirations in favor of the divine plan. Jonathan, the heir to the throne, died along with his father, King Saul, in a battle against the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. This tragic event marked the end of Saul's reign and the beginning of David's rule. Despite being destined to become the new king of Israel, David did not take the throne immediately, choosing first to seek God's guidance. David also showed deep sorrow over the deaths of Saul and Jonathan. He wrote an emotional poem expressing his feelings. In the poem, he laments, "The beauty of Israel lies slain on your heights. How the mighty have fallen! Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice." This poem reveals David's profound sadness at the loss of Saul and Jonathan and highlights the conflicting emotions he faced as he ascended to the throne. David was recognized for his exceptional military leadership skills and victories that extended the borders of Israel, solidifying his image as a respected king. One of his most notable achievements was transporting the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, an act that demonstrated his deep commitment to worshiping God. Determined to bring this sacred symbol to the capital of Israel, David retrieved the Ark from Kiriath Jearim after it had been previously captured by the Philistines. The Ark of the Covenant, also known as the Ark of the Testimony, is a sacred object frequently mentioned in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. It contained the 10 Commandments, engraved on stone tablets given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. Additionally, the ark housed a jar of manna, the food God miraculously provided to the Israelites in the desert, and Aaron's staff, which budded to reaffirm his authority as high priest. The Ark of the Covenant had profound significance for the Israelites, symbolizing the divine presence among them and God's covenant with his people. With joy and great celebration, David led the procession that brought the ark to Jerusalem, dancing before it with fervent devotion. This gesture highlighted the centrality of worship in David's life and established Jerusalem as the city chosen by God. At the height of his military success and reign, David became involved in a serious personal crisis. He succumbed to temptation when he saw Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, one of his loyal soldiers, bathing. Giving in to desire, David committed adultery with her, an act that set off a series of tragic events and deeply affected his governance and spiritual relationship. Bathsheba became pregnant from this encounter, and David, upon discovering it, tried to cover up the scandal. He summoned Uriah from the battlefield, hoping he would spend time with his wife and thus assume the paternity of the child. However, Uriah, demonstrating remarkable integrity, refused to visit his home while his fellow soldiers remained in combat. Faced with Uriah's loyalty, David made a desperate decision and sent him back to the battlefield, but in a manner that placed him in great danger, resulting in his death. Aware of his wrongdoing, David expressed profound remorse in Psalm 51, pleading with God for mercy and forgiveness, saying, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions." God forgave David, recognizing his genuine repentance, but the consequences of his actions still manifested. His son died, and his family faced periods of conflict and instability. At the height of his reign, after winning numerous battles, strengthening Jerusalem and unifying the kingdom of Israel, David faced the challenges of old age. He had achieved great accomplishments and solidified his rule, establishing Jerusalem as both the spiritual and political capital. However, the years weighed heavily on him, and David knew his death was approaching. Aware of the importance of preparing the next generation, he followed divine guidance and felt it was time to pass on God's promise, preparing the way for the future. This important moment is described in the first book of Kings, chapter 2. David called his son Solomon, the heir to the throne, for a final conversation filled with guidance and wisdom. In this dialogue, David highlighted Solomon's great responsibility to maintain the covenant with God, emphasizing that the continuity of their family's reign depended on obedience to the divine commandments. He reminded Solomon of God's promises, explaining that a descendant of his would continue to reign over Israel forever, as long as they remained faithful to God's ways, acting with integrity and justice. Besides the spiritual teachings, David gave Solomon practical advice on how to lead and govern effectively. He instructed his son on how to deal with allies and adversaries, stressing the importance of exercising wisdom, discernment, and firmness in leadership. David emphasized the need to govern with justice, protect the most vulnerable, and promote peace and well-being for all his subjects. This biblical passage not only records the transition of power, but also illustrates the deep connection between faith, leadership, and the legacy left by David in the history of Israel. David died of old age, as described in the first book of Kings in the Old Testament. The biblical text does not specify the cause of his death, but highlights that he died after a life full of challenges and achievements. David is celebrated for his deep faith in God and his significant contributions to the history of Israel. He was a powerful king, a fearless warrior, and an exceptional poet, known for writing many of the Psalms. In his final moments, David offered Solomon instructions and advice on how to govern with wisdom and justice, emphasizing the importance of adhering to divine teachings. He also advised Solomon on how to deal with individuals who had been loyal or disloyal during his reign, suggesting that he act with justice and prudence to ensure the peace and stability of the kingdom. I hope you enjoyed learning more about David's story. Leave in the comments which biblical character you would like to know more about in the next video. A hug and stay with God.